Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. Jam-packed, our first time to talk to Jeff Sentell in a little while. There is a commitment perhaps on the horizon for UGA. We'll talk to Jeff about that. We'll also, just because we sort of have to, sort of deal with the aftermath of some of the things we've seen in recent days. Have not had a chance to speak to Jeff about that. I think it's important to get proper context for kind of what was obviously a massive story last week as it relates to Georgia recruiting. We will do that. There is a really juicy rumor out there today. We'll get to that before we're done. We will tread lightly into a topic that one of the, we don't have a ton of rules around here, but one of the rules I steadfastly follow is I am careful about the subject matter that we address on the show. We will kind of brush up against something today that we don't typically discuss. I feel like we sort of have to. As a well-trained broadcaster, I will do this with a very light touch, which will leave everybody hopefully satisfied. We'll get to that here coming up in just a moment. Off the top of the show, though, there is an ESPN analyst, analytics expert, if you want to call him that. I think in a very blunt way, he has sort of described what might have been the missing piece for Georgia a year ago. And we'll talk about, more importantly, kind of how that relates to Georgia here this season as the Dogs try to pick up the pieces and put the offense back together and show some improvement here in 2025. We'll give you an example of how there seems to be a consensus forming about what Georgia needs and how it gets there for the upcoming season. Does that feel like a pretty good way to begin things today? Or we'll hopefully make good use of your time. Glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We talk about college football all the time around here. I enjoy doing it January, February, all the way through the year. There is, however, a little bit of a different feeling that happens when you talk college football at this part of the year. We are not in the season yet, the actual games being played, but you can tell we're getting closer to it. We're only a few days away from Georgia starting fall camp. Keep in mind that. Like, we're essentially here. But in that time, just before it really gets here, the sort of, the Christmas Eve of it all, if you kind of notice the conversation that's ongoing about college football, it feels just a little different than it sometimes does. And I would describe the reason why it feels different is we have a different level of attention being paid to what everybody's saying. There's always an interesting college football conversation taking place, but this time of year, I would say that, if you'll pardon the phrase, more of like the casual type fans sort of get involved here. And so therefore, there's just a little extra emphasis maybe put on the various opinions that people share. And what you start to see is there is a little bit of a consensus that forms around certain topics, that people start to say things that sort of sound the same. And eventually, as you get to the start of the kickoff, to be totally honest, you also sort of end up feeling, it feels like this has been said quite a bit by now. There is also some of that goes on too. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here for a moment, about the kind of coalescing around ideas, the consensus being formed. I read a very interesting story at ESPN.com within the last couple of days. And to me, some of the stuff that's shared here also sounds a good bit like some of what we've heard recently from some of our guests here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. So I want to read you a few sentences here from the ESPN analytics expert. His name is Bill Conley. He wrote a story recently looking at some of the top playoff contenders for the upcoming season. And as he calls them, the ifs, the sort of unknown factors that will determine if these would-be playoff contenders can actually contend for the national championship. We're obviously going to focus in on what was said about Georgia in all of this. 3, he calls them ifs as it relates to Georgia. I want to run through these one at a time, and frankly, in a slightly different order than Conley presented them at ESPN.com. Let me show you the first here on the screen just for a moment. Once again, very familiar territory from where we've been before. That Georgia can win the national championship here in 2025 if, Conley says, both rebuilt fronts hold up. He says, We can assume Smart's going to put out a absurdly physical defense, but thanks in part to a lack of disruption up front, the Dogs' defense ranked 9th last season, their worst, or maybe least awesome, he says, showing since 2017. He goes on to talk about some of the replacements there. And then he mentions the offensive line as well, losing 2 All-American guards plus 4 starters. He says you return 4 players with starting experience, and they're, of course, the requisite former 4 and 5 stars everywhere you look. He says, but that's still a lot of production to replace, especially considering neither front was quite as strong as usual in 2024. He says, and this is where it gets interesting from Conley. He says, honestly, if I didn't trust Smart so much, I would have made this entry 2 separate categories, basically mentioning both the offensive and the defensive line. But because I'm kind of rephrasing here, the writer trusts Kirby Smart. He says, we'll lump them together and we'll perhaps assume that Smart's got some sort of solution to all of this. And at this point in time on this show, of course, we have talked a lot about that. Getting better with your offensive line. I told you yesterday, I believe that Monroe Freeling and Ernest Green may be the 2 most important players on the entire team for this upcoming season. The same requirement, the need to be better with your defensive front. Georgia wasn't great, for instance, at stopping the run last year. These are 2 areas where if you want to really have the best chance of winning a national championship, being good in both these categories, of course, that's something you need to do. Conley writes that at ESPN.com. We had a guest last week, speaking of ESPN, the ESPN analyst Greg McElroy. You know him. You see him on TV all throughout the fall. And he essentially said the same thing. Hey, big need with your lines of scrimmage, but ultimately this is still a Georgia team that someone like McElroy thinks can be very good. This is what he said on that similar subject just last week.
But I think just with talent kind of spreading out a little bit, I'm still really bullish on Georgia. I think they're going to be great on defense. I'm not at all concerned about what they have in the back 7. Up along the front 7, frankly, I do think there are a couple pieces that I'm curious about. As far as game breakers, take over the game guys along the defensive line, I know they have 1, maybe 2. And then offensive line, too. I think that group has a chance to be pretty good, but last year they had growing pains. When Ratledge got hurt, they weren't the same team. And they had challenges at left tackle too. So I think that's kind of what I'm most curious about. Georgia, the best Georgia teams are built inside out, offensive and defensive lines. Will this team be that way? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I think for Georgia fans, that's what they're hoping for.
So what McElroy says there, so I think similar at least to the theme addressed by Bill Conley. Got to be better up front, offensive and defensive line. McElroy, who watches this stuff closely, says, I believe that can happen, but those questions more significant than some of the other issues around the program. You'll remember we also played some stuff yesterday from McElroy's radio partner, Cole Kubelik, who we also interviewed last week. And Cole went into great detail about his belief that Georgia will be better with its offensive line. And yet, even if we kind of take that somewhat seriously, it doesn't change the fact that it needs to happen if, to use the Conley word, if Georgia's going to be back in the national championship picture. So it's not a surprise that someone like Bill Conley would say all of that. It's also not a surprise that another one of his unknowns for Georgia for the upcoming season would be related to the quarterback. And we get it. We have said over and over that while we are big Gunnar Stockton fans and a big believer that Stockton can get the job done this season, it is not wrong and it is not unfair to have questions about this first-time full-season starting quarterback for Georgia. That is a very realistic appraisal of an obvious situation that Georgia is going to need to provide some emphatic answers to once the season begins. No issue with us whatsoever in talking about that, and Bill Conley did talk about that. I'll show you this on the screen here. We'll get into the Gunnar Stockton part of this. Conley writing at ESPN.com, if Gunnar Stockton is as good as Kirby Smart says. Conley writing that Smart gushed about Stockton at SEC Media Day, saying he's got winner written all over him. The junior, though, was thrown into the deep end late in 2024, playing the first non-garbage time snaps of his career against Texas and Notre Dame. Stockton didn't exactly thrive, Conley writes, having just 4.6 yards per dropback and taking 6 sacks, including a game-turning strip sack against Notre Dame. But that was nearly the toughest situation imaginable. Stockton will have an entire offseason to prep, as if one of the themes of this piece, we won't know if he's ready for the job until he proves it. So what Conley's basically insinuating there is that the results for Gunner against Notre Dame in a full game, Texas in a half game, perhaps they were somewhat mixed from a stat line standpoint. Perhaps that's probably true. But given the way in which Stockton was sort of thrown into it all a year ago, I mean, let's just say it. He played the role of the hero against Texas, coming off the bench against this Longhorns team when Georgia was losing the game, changed the tone of the game, and led Georgia to a win. Not solely because of his performance, but in part because of his performance. The entire fortunes of the team raised along the way. We think that was a good thing for him. And yeah, the overall numbers were not necessarily great for Stockton against Notre Dame. There were drops involved with this, of course, too. Ultimately, though, we certainly think that Gunner played well enough for Georgia to win that game against the Fighting Irish. And if we're pointing fingers of blame at why it didn't, we'd go pretty far down the list, unfortunately, and to be honest, before we got to Gunner's role in all of that. But once again, looking at the stats, looking at the inexperience, asking some pointed questions on all of that, it is certainly a fair conversation to be had. Which brings us back to what Greg McElroy said when he was with us on the interview that we played for you last week, that in addition to the stat line of whatever Gunner does throwing the ball and how Georgia gets better with its passing game or maintains a level of success with its passing game that it had in 2021, 2022, and 2023, that's, of course, obviously very important. But from the Greg McElroy perspective, there is also something else that's crucial when it comes to Georgia's offensive success here this season. And McElroy says that Stockton, in a different way than Conley writes about, can play a big role in making sure that happens. Here is Greg McElroy on the topic of Gunner Stockton last week.
I do think one thing that they absolutely want to be better at is consistently running the football. And that's been an error, kind of a bit of a surprising revelation the last couple of years, is their inconsistency just when you got to run it, running it. And one thing they haven't really utilized is quarterback run game. Now, okay, we saw a couple of years ago, sure, we'd see some quarterback sweep every once in a blue moon, but that wasn't really who they were. I think quarterback power, quarterback stretch, quarterback inside zone read to keep the end man on the line of scrimmage on us. All that stuff will be helpful, and that's all a big part of what Stockton does within his skill set.
So I think that's a really big topic. And it's one of those things that we've got fall camp starting, like a week from now. I mean, maybe almost exactly a week from now for Georgia. When Kirby Smart speaks to begin fall camp, or when Gunner Stockton speaks throughout fall camp, this is one of those questions that I would hope maybe gets asked repeatedly. Because I asked Gunner this when he sat down with us, and you can go to the DawgNation YouTube page. You can watch that interview there. When you look at what's going to happen with the Georgia offense this season, how much of a factor will Gunner Stockton's legs be in what Georgia does offensively? This was a big part of the offense when Stetson Bennett was the starting quarterback. No matter how much people try to lump them together, I do think that Gunner and Stetson are certainly different people, and I think to a degree they're also different players too. Their playing personality is probably a good bit different. And yet I do think that much the same way that Stetson gave Georgia the boost with his legs, if you can get some of that from Gunner this season, it just makes the offense better. And this need to upgrade the running game, well, that obviously gets better too because of that. But you got to be careful. The shot that Gunner took against Texas late in that game, you can't do that because you won't have him for the full season if that be the case. But being careful can't mean you don't use the legs at all, because you get less of a player if you don't add that extra dimension to it. We think that Gunner's got that more certainly than someone like Carson Beck probably did last couple of years for UGA. That needs to be what that needs to be a part of what he does with this Georgia offense, as McElroy states, to help the running game kind of make the improvement it needs to have. And yet all of that sort of leads to this, that in talking about the need to upgrade, offensive and defensive line, get something out of your starting quarterback, all of that from Bill Connelly, very well-traveled ground. He also, though, in a final quote I want to read from you here, from a story you can read for yourself in its entirety for free at ESPN.com, he also makes mention, I think in pretty blunt terms, kind of what cost Georgia in its biggest games a year ago. Certainly the Notre Dame game in the college football playoff that prematurely ended UGA's season. Conley being pretty blunt about the missing piece from all of that. Let me read one more from him here. Conley writing that Georgia can be back in the national championship conversation this season if a veteran receiving corps improves. He says, in the Dogs' last 2 losses of 2024 against Ole Miss and Notre Dame, they scored a total of 20 points. Boy, that doesn't sound good, does it? Conley writes, Beck and Stockton averaged just 10.5 yards per completion while taking 9 sacks. Listen to this now. Many of those sacks were coverage sacks, meaning quarterbacks holding on the ball because no receiver was open. Conley concludes by stating in very blunt fashion, they just didn't have any difference makers out wide. And by now, we have talked about this plenty. What was kind of a lack of Conley's phrase here, difference makers at wide receiver. There were drops. There were very little in the way of explosive plays. That hurt Carson Beck's stats, which meant Georgia scored fewer points, which meant it lost games that otherwise perhaps won, had the offensive performance overall been more explosive. And lately in our show, we've been sort of focusing in on offensive line and running game as kind of the easiest or perhaps maybe most important areas in which you want to see improvement. We've been doing that. And yet, for the entirety of the year, it feels like we can never quite get very far away from this particular subject. That Georgia a year ago was just kind of let down by its wide receiver play. We think that's probably just objectively true. But let me conclude this conversation by saying this. When you look at the various issues of, kind of what Georgia's facing, obviously, we can't predict the future. We don't know exactly how things are going to play out. But let me tell you what I believe. Of all the things that Georgia needs to fix, in a roundabout way, the issue at wide receiver may be the easiest to fix. And that's perhaps surprising, but let me tell you why. Georgia looked at its issues with the receiver a year ago and kind of fell back on an adage that maybe you've heard before, that in life, when you seek improvement in any area, if nothing changes, nothing changes. If you want to lose weight, you better eat differently. You better exercise differently. You better make a change to see a change. And for Georgia, when it comes to receiver and the lack of performance from its receivers, they just went out and got new guys. And sports fans always have a bias in favor of doing something. Teams, programs, organizations, they like continuity. Sports fans like change. If stuff wasn't quite as good as it needed to be, what do you plan on doing about it? I want to see some sort of change. I want the coach to be fired. I want the player to be replaced. I want to see some change. That's sort of the collective bias that all sports fans share. They have a bias in favor of change. They have a bias in favor of doing something. Well, in this particular case, Georgia did something. They brought in 7 new receivers. 2, we think, very impressive transfers, Noah Thomas from Texas A&M, Zachariah Branch from USC. Also, perhaps, the best crop of wide receivers out of high school the program has maybe ever signed, and at least some of those we believe are likely to play here this season. So if Georgia needs to be better with its offensive line, Cole Kublik says he thinks it's going to happen. Some Georgia fans are a little more skeptical because they sort of see the same bodies now asked to just play better than they have in the past. We think it can happen, but for some Georgia fans this offseason, that has been a little bit of a tough sell. We'll find out how true all that is. In the case of wide receiver, though, for Georgia fans who are skeptical about other kinds of change the program might show, this ought to be the easiest area for improvement to sell because Georgia looked at its receiving deficiency last season and said, let's just bring in some arguably better guys. And getting Colby Young back, and after having not played very much, and getting Thomas and Branch and Talon Taylor and C.J. Wiley and players of that magnitude, it just gives you a chance to have better performance because you have a different crop of players now responsible for providing that performance. So at this point in time, you've heard it said, Georgia didn't have enough difference makers, to use Bill Connelly's phrase, at the receiver position a year ago. They have taken some very specific steps to correct that here this season. They have spent a lot of their sort of time and treasure putting a better cast of receivers together for someone like Gunnar Stockton to use. We think he can use him well. And if that ends up being true, then at the end of the season, Georgia is perhaps right where it wants to be. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We are happy that you are with us here today. So excited. In fact, I'm really excited about this. Coming up in like a couple of minutes, like before we do anything else, there is an announcement we've been kind of hinting at and teasing at. We've been trying to get the I's dotted and the T's crossed. Frankly, I don't quite still know if we have all of that done, but we're going to go ahead with it right now anyway. Coming up in a couple of minutes, I got a really, really fun thing I want to tell you about here. So proud of what we were able to provide for you at DawgNation, and sort of a cool thing on that front here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Prior to that, though, big thanks to our friends at Kroger who make all this possible, because the stuff we do for years here on DawgNation, the stuff that we hope to do in the future, it would not happen the way that it always does if not for our friends at Kroger. We're so thankful for that, and I want to give a shout out to them here right now. In fact, as you're enjoying Kroger for everything you got going on here this summer, just keep in mind here that summer fun, I hate it. It is true, though. That summer fun comes to an end eventually. And if you got young kids, they already know this. As a parent, you may be counting down the days in a positive way. Kids, maybe not quite so much. It is almost back to school time, and it's probably already back to school shopping time. Well, as you're getting everything ready for your own back to school experience, the stuff that goes in the lunchbox that your kids maybe or may not eat, but it's still you got to pack it for them. The stuff that goes in the lunchbox, all the supplies, everything else, the healthy snacks, of course. All of that to get you ready for that first day of school. Our friends at Kroger got you ready to go on all of that. Plus, when everybody gets home after a busy day at school, sports practices, things like that, you know everybody's hungry. So how about those easy dinner options, too, to kind of make all of that kind of go smoothly, sort of get you back in the back-to-school routine. Our friends at Kroger got you on everything as it relates to that. So find out more in-store or online at Kroger.com. Okay, busy for us today in a couple of minutes. Always fun and always easy. We're to bring on Jeff Sentell. We're going to do some UGA recruiting talk with Jeff Sentell. That is going to be fun because the Dogs may be on the doorstep here in a few days of another commitment. We'll tell you what we know about that here coming up in just a couple of minutes' time. Also, in a couple of seconds here, too, I'm going to take a risk. And I'm going to talk about something that we really worked very hard not to talk about. It's one of the best decisions we've ever made. We try to be the kind of space where everybody can feel comfortable, but there are moments when it's perhaps unavoidable. This topic today, we believe, is unavoidable. And I believe I also probably have a slightly different take on some of this than you're hearing elsewhere. We'll give that to you here coming up in just a couple of minutes. But before we get to any of that, can I officially let the cat out of the bag on a very big event set to take place for DawgNation here during the 2025 season, and you are invited to be a part of it. A lot of you have been saying, BA, when's the next time DawgNation going to do something really big? Well, we're now able to tell you that we are bringing back here for 2025 what we did in 2023 that ended up being one of the most popular things we have ever done. The DawgNation Invasion is set to return in Knoxville for the big game against Tennessee. This is the riverboat. This is all of that, the wonderful, buffet experience on board, the chance to enjoy some beverages, all of that included with your price here, the DawgNation swag. We're going to be hanging out and having a good time. And folks, this is a little bit different. When we did DawgNation Invasion in 2023, the game was in November. This year, as you know, the game is in September. We're really only a few weeks away from this. So it's time to make your plans, both if you, and by the way, if you're watching in video, how cool is that? That's the SEC Network television shot that day. Our DawgNation Invasion was such a big deal that it actually got, shown on TV on the SEC Network that particular day. This was truly one of the most fun things we've ever done around DawgNation. It is going to be among the most fun things we'll do here in the 2025 season. I can't wait for it all. I want you to be a part of it with it. So let me give you the website. And if you'll go to this website, It'll give you everything you need, including your chance to purchase your tickets. We want you to be a part of this. It's DawgNation.com/tailgate/Tennessee. A little long, but you get what I'm saying here. DawgNation.com/tailgate/Tennessee. The Dawg Nation invasion on the riverboat. The last time we did this, those Vols fans were beside themselves. Well, guess what? By the time the game was over, they were even angrier because of what Georgia did to them on the field. We think the same thing's going to go down here this season, and we're going to kick it off in style with the Dawg Nation invasion tailgate. Food and beverage on board the boat, Dawg Nation folks hanging out, some Dawg Nation swag. Y'all, this is going to be an incredible experience in Knoxville on the Tennessee River. One of the sort of classic spots in the SEC, painted red and black on this day. We want you to be a part of it. So one more time on that website, it's DawgNation.com/tailgate/Tennessee. We want to see you for our Dawg Nation invasion this September in Knoxville. Can't wait for all of that. Now, let's get ready to go around the DawgHouse here right now, presented today by our friends at Zagoria Law. And let's get risky just for a moment, because here's the one thing I have learned in my time doing the show, more than 2,500 episodes. Georgia fans come in all varieties, right? And different varieties of folks represent different points of view. And so therefore, I sort of treat this show as a little bit of like a dinner table type thing, where like we talk about stuff that's comfortable for people at the dinner table. We don't needlessly sort of troll people or stir them up. We want this to be a pleasant experience. And we think in life, we could probably use a few more pleasant experiences. And so we try to make this show as pleasant as possible. That means something like politics, for instance. We just stay as far away from that as we possibly can. If you want politics, there are places you can go to get that. You perhaps are aware there is a media that serves political takes. If you want that, there are places you can go for it. We try to stay in our lane around here. But every now and then, politics comes into our lane, and we would look foolish to completely ignore that. So let me give you this here right now. Yesterday, you perhaps saw the President of the United States issued an executive order as it relates to the future of college athletics. I'll show you this from our friend Ross Dellinger on the screen. It is called Saving College Sports. Dellinger wrote about this at Yahoo, saying the president released an executive order titled Saving College Sports, but will it? And in that sort of dives deeper on all of this. It'd take us a long time, and it would turn this into a different show to sort of rally through, run through all of the bullet points related to this, executive order. Let me see if I can sort of chat GPT style sum this up in an effective way and judge for yourself if I did. The basic gist of this executive order is that it wants to try to bring an end to the so-called pay for play while also allowing space for athletes to earn fair compensation. And some of this relates to and y'all don't gloss over and don't tune me out. I promise this is super quick. Don't shut me off. Some of this relates to like the National Labor Relations Board making some rulings on the employment status of athletes and things like that. But that's the basic gist of it, is that compensation is here to stay, but is there a way to do this while also preserving some version of what college athletics have been? That's the nature of the executive order. Here is what you're going to hear kind of on both sides of this. First of all, NCAA, lots of coaches, people within college athletics, they're actually sort of celebrating this. They think this is a good news that the chief executive of our government is attempting to get involved in all this. You're hearing, including Charlie Baker, the NCAA president, they're saying this. Critics are going to say that, well, there's really not all that much this executive order is going to be able to do. That's the discussion point in all of this. I think what everyone would probably agree on is that actual legislation coming from Congress, and once again, please don't tune me out because I promise we're doing this for like 90 more seconds and then we're done with this for the rest of the show. That actual legislation from Congress would have a lot more staying power for the future of college athletics than just something that comes from an executive order for reasons I won't bore you with, but if you follow politics, you sort of understand and just just the general news, you probably understand some of why folks feel that way. Well, guess what? There's even more good news on the saving college sports front, because in addition to the president's executive order, separate from that, you also had a pretty big step in Congress yesterday in a way that we hadn't really seen in the past. I'll show you this from the folks over at Politico, perhaps the first time we've cited Politico on this show before. Headline: College Athletics Overhaul Clears House Committees. Lawmakers, it says, adopted a suite of changes to the original bill, including a provision requiring NCAA boards to set aside a portion of its membership, blah, 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 blah. The point is that the sort of House of Representatives version of quote-unquote saving college sports has now got out of committee and perhaps set up to be voted on by the House of Representatives. Still a big hurdle to kind of get through the Senate or anything like that. Totally get that. There is some bipartisan support for this, though. The point I would get to is this, though, is that there is some movement in Washington for some sort of defense against the wild, imposed chaos that college athletics has been forced to endure in recent years. And I do think that's a good thing. And I would think that's a good thing no matter what politician was choosing to support it. And eventually I do think we'll see politicians on both sides perhaps getting involved with this. And there's no guarantee there's any ever a law passed or an executive order, at least this particular one, changed the game. I don't know anyone who thinks that it will. But let me just sort of give you 2 final points to sort of think about. Thing number 1 is this. No matter what side of the political aisle you're on, I think you would say that politicians say and do popular things. At least they try to, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be politicians very long. Can we agree on that as just sort of a basic premise, is that politicians are always in search of what's popular because their security in their role and their job is sort of based on a certain measure of popularity? And that, to me, should be the big takeaway on this. Bill getting out of committee in the House of Representatives, president saying what he's saying, people from the other party sort of getting involved in this at least a little bit too, including more in the Senate than you perhaps realize. That what we see now in a way that was not true a few years ago. Like a few years ago, I was shocked at how quickly the idea of college athletics had seemed to become unpopular, especially in what we sort of think of as the, kind of the highest levels of government and business and things like that. College athletics had just sort of gotten a little bit of a bad reputation. And I was shocked at how quickly that had happened. Well, when you see politicians now saying sort of the opposite of what folks were perhaps, the message that was amplified a few years ago, I think that gives you a little bit of a perhaps reason to believe that public opinion is somewhat changing. The reaction to the Nico Iamaleava situation at Tennessee was our first really big clue of that, is that folks are, I'm talking about regular folks who don't necessarily have a huge platform and don't necessarily have their opinion reflected in the way that a lot of these stories get covered. They're just kind of grossed out by some of this stuff. And there's a little bit of a gag reflex kind of showing up with like, this is not what I want college sports to be. And politicians whose job security depends on some sort of connection with the public, they're kind of noticing. And I don't think that's a bad thing, and I want to apologize for feeling that way. And I'll finally finish with this. In addition to that, there are some people who say, well, even if Congress could do something about this, even if a president from either party could do something about this, this isn't a good use of Washington's time. I will say that I vehemently disagree with that. What better thing for our elected officials to do more so than protect an important institution that has proven to be so valuable to those of us who enjoy it as a pastime, to those who depend on it for like their livelihood, for those who, are developed by it to become better men on the other side of it? What better use of Washington's time than to protect something that has been as important to American history as college athletics have been? So once again, people have very strong feelings sometimes about politics on one side or the other. I think there's plenty of room for all of that. But I would say hopefully we can agree that politicians of any stripe stepping in to solve what is an obvious problem, that in some form or fashion, that's probably a good thing. And that is Around the DawgHouse, presented today by our friends at Zagoria Law. Now, what is not a good thing is if you or someone you love have been injured, bitten by a dog, or knocked over. Dogs, big, strong dogs, can cause all kinds of pain and suffering for you and those that you love, including dog bites, which in some cases can be lethal. So if that's a story that you've dealt with, well, obviously we think that you deserve your chance to fight for compensation just like any other personal injury situation. And if you find yourself ready to kind of have your day in court, well, of course, you'd want to be working with a lawyer that specializes in this sort of thing. And in Georgia, the only folks who specialize in this particular branch of personal injury law are our friends at Zagoria Law. They literally wrote the book on how to win these types of cases. So I want you to give them a call. 833-GA-DOGBITE. That's D-O-G. 833-GA-DOGBITE, D-O-G. Or online, ZagoriaLaw.com. Z-A-G-O-R-I-A. ZagoriaLaw.com on a lot more of that. All right, I'm dying to speak to him. It's been a while since we have, so let's jump into it here right now. Sorry for keeping him waiting. We're running later than even normal here. Let's talk to Jeff Sentell here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
One of our DawgNation.com chatters, I said, listen, we're going to do this for 90 seconds. He said, BA, this is more 90 seconds. So I apologize for that, but we are done with that now. Let me bring in Jeff Sentell here, fresh off his vacation. Great to have him back on the program. Jeff, I won't rehash everything that I just said. We don't need to do that. But I do want to ask you this in light of some of the stuff we've seen go on with Derek Cooper, James Johnson, whatever else, that whatever the House settlement was supposed to do, and we sort of said this at the time, this is not going to work. And, unfortunately, this gets added to the list of things we've been right about, that whatever people thought the House settlement was supposed to do, that sheet of paper is actually powerless to stop anyone from doing what they want to do. And what people want to do is participate in the sort of pay for play that became the norm post 2021. Can we agree that that's the lay of the land, that there is a House settlement, there's supposedly scrutiny for NIL deals, but folks by and large are still in some form or fashion at the highest level operating in the NIL space, sort of the way they always have? Is that fair?
I think it is, Brennan. I think the one thing that really strikes me is how was all this ever going to be enforceable? And I think you mentioned, while you dropped some Politico, you dropped some National Labor Relations Boards. I think those were things that people weren't expecting on their Friday DawgNation Daily bingo card. I feel like that was always the case. Like, here's Texas, a great example. Like, I don't know, Brennan, since the last time we spoke, I think Georgia had 20 commitments or something like that. Now they're at 30. Maybe it was like 23, 24, but I always knew with Texas, because Texas, people might not remember this, but Texas was in big with Mark Bowman. They were in big with a lot of other major candidates, Caden Prothro, whatever. I always felt Texas had I guess I would use hammer, but most others would probably say, Jeff, what you're trying to say there is bag. They didn't really have a big spend yet. And that they had reserves besides all those Lambos on their OVs coming. And that's one of those things that you knew Texas was going to Texas. But for me, I just wonder about it with your roster getting upside down in terms of they paid premiums to pry them away from Georgia for players that the National Football League, who's been paying players for eons now, they don't value those positions and they don't place a premium on those positions. Don't get me wrong, those two are great players, but that's not the type of spend you see from the NFL's 32 franchises. And that's what I kind of think makes Texas what Texas is doing a little bit different.
I mean, I think that when people saw the Cooper thing go down, and look, I know that if you're not a Georgia fan and you listen on conversations like this, some of this sort of comes across as just sort of sour grapes because Georgia didn't get a player. And I won't completely discount that aspect of this, that if Georgia had just sort of clean swept the board, well, there's no, we're not going to have a whole lot of complaining going on because Georgia's getting whoever it wants. So I do grant that there's a little bit of a, Georgia didn't get somebody, so now we're looking to see, we're going to put the system on trial because Georgia didn't get a player. But having said that, Jeff, the thing that I'm hearing from Georgia fans is not so much how come Georgia's not getting every player that it wants. What a lot of people are sort of saying is, boy, one of my favorite sources of entertainment following recruiting, it sort of feels like that's just kind of, I don't know. I mean, if if a guy like Cooper goes to Texas without taking an official visit, I'm talking about if he commits to Texas, we believe going to go there, without taking an official visit, and if I have my facts right, I think that I know of only visited Texas one time. Like, that's not fun for people who follow recruiting, because I don't care what Sark says, that's just buying a player. I mean, that's all that is. If you're choosing Texas on the basis of one visit, hard to make that anything other than a purchase. And people are kind of grossed out by that.
I mean, Brandon, it was also not only that, they out-purchased Miami, who was willing to spend quite a lot for Cooper in his own backyard. And that's the school he visited even more than Georgia. Miami was first, Georgia was second. The thing about Cooper, though, is the eval's kind of skewed. Like, is he the best running back in the country? No, he's probably 3 or 4, maybe 2 by some evaluators. But a lot of things with Cooper, you look at him and you go, is that really his best position? Because he does want to play running back. But if you look at him, you look at the skill set, maybe he's a star, maybe he's a safety, maybe he could do a lot of things. I want to just zoom in on one thing you said there about recruiting and entertainment and everything else. I think it just gets so very hard, because the main thing I hear from players, I hear from our readers and our community, Brandon, is I don't know whether the word feels embarrassed or like, listen, college football fans are proud. If you ever see their tailgates, if you ever see some of their vehicles on game day, they want to show off a little bit. They want to show that they got something and they're supporting. And there's this era of, Georgia finishing second to so many big spenders. And it's like, why don't the Dogs have money? Are the Dogs like a clipping coupons, a digital coupon, discount rate type program? I think people don't understand the full sweep of it. Well, we talked on Before the Hedges this week about, our Kaylee Mansell was like, why should people really care? Where's the buy-in? Where's the fan investment anymore? And Brandon, I think you should look at every one of these players, and every one of these players, whether it's the psychology of Kirby Smart's team building, where they don't want to have them make it, so to speak, before they even play a college down. But he realizes that all the players, they want them to come to Georgia more for than just the bag, more than just the money. And I would push back and I would say, listen, literally everybody in this recruiting class has taken less money to be at Georgia than somewhere else. Now, is that the 2025 version of always wanted to be a Dog or just love Georgia? Maybe that is the new modern interpretation, when you take significantly less money to go to the school that you love or the one that you feel will develop you better than any other or where you wanted to be. Maybe that's the modern definition. But the one thing, the big perspective thing here is just look at Georgia's recruiting class last year. You've got number 1 defensive lineman in the country, Elijah Griffin. Number 1 outside linebacker in the country, Isaiah Gibson. Number 1 linebacker in the country, Zayden Walker. Number 4 wide receiver in the country, number 5, Talon Taylor. All those buys, all those players were expensive. And it's like when you start stacking up year after year, you got to look at it in this new economy, Brennan. It's kind of like Major League Baseball. Like, your stud at this position is locked up for 3 or 4 years, and that's basically all you got in terms of a premium buy. So
what I said yesterday was, as it relates to this topic, is it reminds me a little bit of the Atlanta Braves, a little bit. Like you say, hey, almost every player at Georgia has taken less money to be here than perhaps you could have gotten somewhere else. But in and of itself, I don't care about that. I mean, as a fan, that's just sort of neutral to me. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that's perhaps true. I feel the same way with the Braves. Ronald Acuna is one of the best players in baseball. Atlanta has him locked up long-term to an incredibly team-friendly deal. But the fact that, Acuna took less money for an earlier contract than he perhaps, could have gotten other places, once again, doesn't make me feel either good or bad. It's just neutral. Fans don't root for balance sheets. So the only way that so-and-so being at Georgia for less money, there was reporting this week about Jared Curtis, the only way so-and-so being at Georgia for less money or so-and-so playing for the Braves for less money, the only way that matters to me personally as a fan is if the money you saved on player X is used to help get player Y. And as I mentioned, we're not a baseball show, but in the case of the Braves, it's not obvious the money they've saved on someone like Acuna or, Ozzie Albies, who's had obviously a little bit of a troubling season, but it's not obvious the money they've saved on some of these players was well used on other spots of their roster. With Georgia, obviously they're in a better situation overall, but the idea of, boy, Georgia's judicious with its spin. Georgia's stretching its dollars to make them go further. Well, I only care about that if it improves the roster in other places. And I would say that the jury is out on that. I mean, there's obviously a chance this is as strong a roster as it exists in college football this upcoming season, next season, whatever else too. Clearly, Georgia's in a pretty good position. But this notion of, boy, Georgia's getting guys at a discount, guys at a bargain, that's only important to me is if Georgia then uses the leftover money to go out and get other players.
I mean, how do you feel about it this way, Brendan? Because, you're sitting there and looking at all these pieces, and Georgia has learned through trial and error, man. We can point to numerous players, Marvin Jones, Damon Wilson. Georgia has a track record of where Georgia sets the market or wins the highest bid. It doesn't usually, or it's not always universally working out in Georgia's favor. So that's one of those things where I guess I come back to the psychology of players come to Georgia with a mentality that they're looking to earn rather than already earned top dollar. I think that bodes well with the overall development of the program. Brennan, I know you're a very well-read dude. Did you see the ESPN story this week about Mike Locksley in Maryland?
I did see that. It was we actually, I think, briefly mentioned on the show yesterday. I think we did that. I asked Terrence about this because what Locksley said was exactly what Kirby Smart said he's worried about. And I'll let you, make your point. Locksley basically saying, we lost our locker room a year ago because of younger players making more than older players.
Yeah, and Locksley's a guy that kind of champions himself as a guy that's a great locker room czar, great locker room wizard. And, Maryland had some money, and Maryland they're going through it with a lot of five-star players where they've got about 4 bullets in their holster, and they want to get the 4 best bullets they can, the 4 biggest players they can, most talented players they can, and that will anchor their recruiting class, and then they'll fill it in with a lot of other stuff. But to hear a coach so candidly talk about that said he lost the locker room, it's very interesting. Brandon, a great example here now, Brandon, is Jared Curtis. The reported, when he was committing to Georgia, the word kind of leaked out that, and he was eventually shutting it down. The word kind of came out that it was a multi-year deal, like year 1, year 2, and year 3 would all be multi-layered depending on basically what was expected out of him at Georgia. So look at it this way. Aside from outside NIL deals, if Jared Curtis was on the Georgia roster right now, he'd be the highest paid NIL quarterback. And although he would be at least 2 players away from starting. And that's the way you've got to look at it. But then the other things is that recruits now, I'll cross-reference something. Teddy Girard, a really good quarterback out of North Cobb Christian, now at North Cobb, just committed to Notre Dame yesterday. He looked good, Brandon. He went from a guy that was just kind of a mid 4-star guy to now he looked like one of the best quarterbacks in the country and a true 5-star quarterback. I think recruits know and recruits see that Georgia is invested in Curtis going forward. And Curtis is set to be the guy. So they don't want to wade into that depth chart situation any more than maybe in years past when they see a dedicated starter there, like maybe a Carson Beck, and maybe that was what shied away some of the Dylan Raiolas or whatever in the past, or they see a dedicated starter that's there for multiple years. I believe that happened with when Aaron Murray was the quarterback. Not only that, but there's the pay investment involved in where Georgia's 2027 quarterback, even though it could be in state like Girard, I think the stars and the lure connected to that guy are going to be dimmer because that prospect knows that, hey, I'm really not likely to get the ball and get the reins until Curtis's time is up. So I think that's one way to look at it in terms of, Curtis did take less, but Curtis is still the fact that he's at Georgia, the fact that how much he makes. I think even the greatest locker rooms, it's going to be hard to weather that type of stuff.
Okay, let me do a couple of other things, and I want to be respectful of your time here. Let's start with some good news, or at least the potential for good news. We're only a few days away from Anthony Lonan's commitment. You wrote about him this week at DawgNation.com. Seems to be kind of a fast-rising defensive line prospect. This feels like a recruiting battle that Georgia could be set up to win. What can you tell us about Lonan and kind of where things stand with him at the moment?
It's Georgia or Georgia Tech, Brandon. True in-state, clean old-fashioned hate recruiting battle. And it was very interesting talking to London and a lot of people around him. I got to talk to his dad, former Georgia football player. His career at Georgia was kind of cut short by a neck injury. And it's kind of funny, Brandon. You ever hear those? You're a parent. You've heard this before. Like you hear those things about you don't want your child to live out your dreams. You want your child to live out their own dreams. But then at the same time,
well, actually, I want my kids to do everything I tell them to do. Like I want their dreams to be the exact same as mine. Is what I want.
Waiting for the BA DawgNation Daily parenting book that's going to come out and everything else. But what it is like it's very interesting to listen to his father talk about it because he's like, yes, that's my son. I want him to live out his own dream. But then there's very much unfulfilled dreams for the London family at Georgia. The mother is a double dog, loves the dogs. I don't think they have any navy blue and gold in their closets as of yet. But then you hear London, and London's dream is kind of like he wants to have the career at Georgia that his father didn't. And that's one of those things that make me think about, even Georgia Tech's recruited him well. And even though Georgia Tech has got a guy, Jeff Sentell, who knows what he's doing, he's been a long time coach at the high school, college, and pro levels. And even they were on Anthony London with an offer before the Dogs. There's still that hometown lure. Georgia was his dream school for a lot of his time growing up. And Brendan, it's an interesting position fit because one thing I put in that story, I hope people got to it, is there's the teeter-totter about Georgia and Georgia Tech with what the eventual choice will be. But Anthony A.J. London told me something that I thought was very interesting. And tinfoil hat theory, folks, I want you to lean in close on this because he said the way Trey Scott is building the future defensive lines at Georgia, he wants quicker, twitchier guys. And kind of guys in that Aaron Donald mold. Well, sure, who wouldn't like to find another Aaron Donald because those are, one of ones. But that makes Anthony London a little bit more probable because if you look at his game last year, Brandon, he was about 6'2", he's about 240, maybe 235, and he was knifing in the backfields. He was chasing down plays on the backside, but that's not what Georgia asked to do out of its three techs in the SEC, not at all. Well, now he is put on weight. He's 260, 265 pounds. Here's where the tinfoil hat theory stuff comes in. Georgia can't build its defensive line room with guys like Elijah Griffin every year. Just too costly. Those are the most highest big ticket, expensive items on the recruiting landscape right now. So they got to find some of these guys like a London who is developing, and he could be a versatile chess piece. He could play the 3 to the 9, depending on where it goes from, where his body goes in the next 3 or 4 years. But I think that's a player. London's a player. While he's still rated as a 4-star and a top 300 player in the country, the spin there, Brandon, is what I'm trying to say. And it seems like it's all connected these days with that. Those are some of the pieces when you need to put together 6-7 man defensive line classes. You're going to have to look for those guys that kind of fit a certain need. And obviously, Brandon, I know your air has been dominated all week with the 7 Cloud stuff and the James Johnson flip. Certainly Georgia now more than ever needs a credible defensive lineman to add more depth to this class.
Okay, really quickly before we let you go, and I want to be respectful here, you do mention 7 Clouds, worth pointing out, I guess charges 7 Cloud now facing those, an even more troubling situation, or at least certainly for different reasons, a very troubling situation involving Chase Calicut here, a defensive back commit out of the state of Texas. Jeff, what can you tell us about what comes next for both of these young men facing their own version of charges right now?
Brandon, man, these are really tough stories. And as much as we want to make it about Georgia adding more firepower to its team and bolstering the class with more future NFL guys, especially at the defensive line spot, which Georgia's going to need more of those after Christian Miller moves on, and maybe even Xavier McLeod after this year, or maybe Jordan Hall. Man, these lives are just wrecked. And I don't know if you feel the same way as I do about it, but you see now that I don't expect either of them to be in the class, Brandon. I really don't, because there's a lot of reasons why. Um, Multiple instances. Obviously, some of these charges are very serious. You see, I don't know if you noticed this week, but Calicut's family was a very strong, supportive family. I got to meet all of them. We talked about it on Before the Hedges. They've now started a GoFundMe to kind of help with his legal defense and everything else. And with Seven Cloud, Brandon, I think this story is probably, it kind of feels like the unreachable goal, and it sort of breaks your heart a little bit because Seven has had perhaps the longest road to Athens, Georgia of any of any recruit that I've reported on in my time here at DawgNation. And it just doesn't feel like it's going to happen for either of these young men now. And, you know, Kirby Smart always says it's a privilege to be a Bulldog. And I think that thing's carrying a lot of weight right now. And in cloud space specifically, this is a young man where there's multiple things. This is a young man that was already in junior college. And this is a young man that you can't really play that just a 17, 18-year-old kid card. This is a 22, 23, 24-year-old guy that's come in with a lot of life experiences. So it's really just sad, as much as I want to sit there and say, well, Georgia won't get the #1 class, or there goes a projected 2 deep impact player for Georgia across the defensive line. The father in me, the human being in me, just sees two very compromised futures and kind of wrecked lives.
All right, let me just say something real quick about all of this. Like the one thing that kind of keeps coming back into my mind, whether it be Cloud or, you know, Calicut, the public seems to think that when a player gets in trouble, you know, alleged criminal activity, when a player gets in trouble, the coach bears some responsibility for that there is something for the coach to do in response to this. Fair or not, there is a large percentage of the public that sort of thinks that. Here's the one thing I do wish, Jeff, whether it be Seven Cloud or Chase Calicut or whatever the next story we're going to hear as it relates to this. We live in a day and age right now where before these guys get to Georgia, and even while they're at Georgia, they have just as much contact, if not more, with their own agents. All of these guys now have player representatives. We know a little bit more about that about Seven Cloud than at least I do as it relates to Chase Calicut. But we live in a day and age now where all players have some form of representation. They are part of, you know, that team as much as they're a part of their own college team. In the future, we talk about what's Kirby Smart going to do about blah, 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 or what other coach and his own players, recruits, whatever else, that perhaps, face troubling allegations. When that happens, I hope that we make the agent as famous as we make the coach. I really do. And I'm not blaming the agents here. I'm really not. I don't have any reason to think that they've done anything wrong. I'm just saying that the public opinion has always veered back in the direction of what is so-and-so coach going to do about so-and-so players' troubling allegations. I think it's just as fair to say, what is grown adult agent going to do about the, in some cases minor, now not the case of Seven Cloud, but in some cases minor, someone younger than the age of 18 who he has a business relationship with. What is that full-fledged, full-grown adult going to do about this? Does the agent, does the player representative have any responsibility in any of this at all? Because the day and age of all of this belonging to the coach, I think that needs to be over with.
Brendan, you make me think a lot about this point, and this is a point I've kind of had to search my feelings about a lot over the last week in terms of these stories. And I want to know why it is the way it is. First of all, we made this point on Before the Hedges this week. I want to make sure I bring it to the big show, Brandon. These deals, I'm sure you're aware of the August 1st deadline and how everybody tried to front load things earlier in the summer to get these players locked away. Here's what I see happening. It's really like speed dating, Brandon, where you don't have the time to get to know a player. You get to know the family, you get to be in their lives like you did in the past. Everything has happened it's moving at a speed faster than we've ever seen before, Brandon. I was looking through some of my archives recently, working on a story this week. And Brandon, it wasn't even 2022 when players weren't even taking their mega official visits until the fall, until October. And now all the classes, everybody's officialed, everybody's signed, everybody's locked away. It gives these programs less of a chance, I want to say character vetting, but actually more than anything else, it's to build the right relationship with these players because it all feels a little bit too much transactional. That's one point. The second point is this, Brendan, and I just want discourse on this because I don't claim to know everything here, but public opinion is what it is. How is it when these things happen to recruits, all of the blame or most of the public eye goes on, oh, Kirby Smart in Georgia recruited that kid to come be a Bulldog? Do most folks realize that Georgia's presence in their lives is minimal compared to the people around them at their current high school, their families and everything else? Like, is it really a failure of Georgia by recruiting these players when they're not really in their lives yet as much as their inner circles have been? But yet you don't really hear a lot about that. Like, why do you think that is, Brandon?
Well, I just think it's the name that's famous, right? The coach is the name that's famous. The coach is the person historically that's been subject of public vetting. And we've got this entirely new category within college athletics that didn't used to exist. And once again, I'm neither assuming guilt on the part of the two players we're talking about or casting any kind of specific blame on any of the folks around them. But there's a lot more stakeholders within college athletics than there used to be. And if something goes wrong or there are allegations that something has gone wrong with the player, given the fact there's a whole lot more folks involved in college athletics than once were, if there is blame to go around, I think that blame ought to be distributed to other places than just the coach.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I think. Those people are in their lives, and yet obviously the famous name there is Georgia. I hear some fans tell me that, the thing that bothers them about amongst all this police blotter is the player and all the pictures online, or it's in Georgia gear, they're in Georgia colors, and really they're not even technically at Georgia yet, where the program can have some influence on their lives and day to day. And it is kind of a double standard, Brandon, because I think some of these allegations, maybe to not the severity as they are right now, the program kind of weathers that a little more when they're internal, whereas football and college football has gotten so complicated and so much a business right now that it's almost like, why do you want to bring in, I'm going to use the word employee here, why do you want to bring an employee with these kind of checks on his resume before he even gets into college football and everything else? I mean, that's just one of the things to consider. It is just the stigma of the way things are today. But that's one of the things I had on my mind is it's largely a failure all around the young person when they keep making these mistakes. And I don't know if the college football program they're committed to, I don't know if I feel like they're carrying a heavier share of the burden than others. Jeff,
great to talk to you. I've missed you. I'm glad you had a great vacation. Glad you're back with us. We'll have plenty of fun things to discuss in the weeks to come. Look forward to it. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you back here very soon on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
Hey, Brandon, appreciate it. Happy 2502.
Thank you very much, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Speaking of episode number 2500, which we celebrated this week, one of our DawgNation.com chatters put a really interesting stat together about the episodes. It was incredibly nice. I took a screenshot of it. I hope I captured it. We'll have that for you maybe as a golden shoe next week. But very, very kind to see that. I really love that. And great talk to Jeff Sentell. We are also shockingly late, so we have got to pick up the pace here a little bit. Otherwise, this one's going to get obnoxious. So let me say this. We are cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and you owe it to yourself. We made the big announcement earlier about our DawgNation invasion coming to Knoxville later on this year. That's going to be really just a few weeks away in September. Excited about that. But the fun that we have on kind of an individual DawgNation event, is just a taste of what you get over the expanse of 4 nights on board with us on Utopia of the Seas for our DawgNation cruise. This April, it's coming back. And y'all, you owe it to yourself to be a part of this. It's a chance to, like I was just doing with Jeff, kind of kicking around and talking about everything related to Georgia recruiting or whatever conversation you want to have. It's the most relaxed we ever really are because in the normal year, we're in the cadence of a season. Well, this is not really like that. This is sort of letting our hair down and maybe kicking back and relaxing, and we enjoy the experience that we have with the hundreds of Georgia fans who join us. We want you to be a part of it too. So please give Jessica Slater a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, a couple of stories here. We got a fun rumor we'll give you before the show is done today. Do you remember, I believe it was last week at this time, something I do not do very much is I gave Brian Kelly some credit on this show. Do you remember that? I said that I thought that Kelly was one of kind of the low-key winners of SEC Media Days because Kelly did something that I like for coaches to do. He owned what might be the biggest issue facing his program, took it full on, head on, did not sidestep it, didn't talk around it. He said we've got to be better in week 1 games. He has made a point of saying within the program in Baton Rouge, they have put a strong emphasis on the game to kick off the 2025 season against Clemson. And folks, how good is that game? There's so many fun week 1 games, but LSU Clemson's about as good as anything. That is really, really good. And Brian Kelly, to his credit, after having lost to USC and a couple of times to Florida State, he says, we don't need to lose any more week 1 non-conference games. We need to beat Clemson. We think that's a really good thing to say. And yet in true Brian Kelly fashion, he somehow can't leave well enough alone in emphasizing the Clemson game. He is now sort of bordered into sort of a weird version of trash talk where he is now called, Clemson and LSU both play in stadiums they like to call Death Valley. And so now he's sort of called Clemson's version of Death Valley Junior, which is not the most egregious hot take we've ever heard. That's not the worst trash talk we've ever heard. But now these Clemson people are spinning this as bulletin board material. And they're kind of using this to say, we're going to shut Brian Kelly up for good, which is probably silly. I'll grant that. But it just goes to show that Brian Kelly, I think he always suffers from like perpetual inauthenticity, that he just can't like be a normal person. And even when he like tries to do a thing of, hey, we're going to put an emphasis on the game against Clemson, which you probably should, even with that, he still sort of takes it too far and kind of turns into something that's just a little too try hard. Maybe an example of that, Clemson feels like it's got bulletin board material coming in the way of some comments from LSU coach Brian Kelly. All right, there is a story that's been going on for a couple of days. It's our first time mentioning this, but you ought to know about this. Very good Tennessee defensive back, would-be second-year player in the program, Boo Carter, according to some reporting from the Knoxville News-Sentinel, is not with the team. Now, there have been like tons of rumors about this, and it's sort of hard to know exactly what's going on. Let me just sort of read kind of what the Knoxville News-Sentinel's reported on this, that he's missed team activities. He's basically not with the team right now. He's had a little bit of a confrontation with team leaders. They've been unhappy with him. Supposedly, this is not NIL related. I think what CBS Sports has specifically reported, based on their sources, is this isn't a Nico Iamaleava style holdout. Originally, there were some rumors that some of this may be related to NIL. Frankly, I'm still not willing to completely disregard that aspect of this, although on-the-record reporting is saying that isn't true. Either way, though, you do deserve to know that Tennessee's perhaps right now, ahead of the start of fall camp, without one of its more important defensive players, a freshman All-American from a year ago, not with the team. And based on some pretty serious reporting that's out there, it's not obvious when he might return. This is certainly something worth monitoring. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, we'll also get ready for hold on now. False start. Before we get ready to wrap it up today, we've got to get ready to give you a long drink, long finish. So we'll get to the golden shoe and we'll kind of wrap up the show. We got to give you a long drink, long finish before we get there, though. And this is just for fun today. You know, we always talk about our friends at the Finish Long Drink, the traditional citrus. It's the gin kick, the grapefruit flavor. Well, if you like grapefruit, you like this juicy rumor. How about that for corny analogies and corny segues? You like this juicy rumor as it relates to the SEC. Pretty big website that covers the University of North Carolina. It's called Inside Carolina. They have reported, and I'll show you this on the screen here just for a moment, that North Carolina is exploring a potential move from the ACC to the SEC. So UNC, the big team here in this, there's also some rumblings and grumblings about certainly Clemson too, other of these usual suspects. And the basic gist of this is that there is a grant of rights agreement that's holding the ACC together. And at this point in time, that contract is about the only thing keeping this league together. But as you get into future years, the sort of exit fee for the ACC starts to go down. I'm talking about kind of a long-range discussion here, years into the future. And at that point in time, folks are saying, hey, North Carolina may have interest in the SEC. We've long believed that the SEC may have interest in North Carolina. This is not the sort of thing that's going to happen tomorrow, but there's at least some chatter. This might be a thing that happens eventually. And it's worth noting that if the SEC does expand, it ain't Florida State. It's not going to be a team in a state where the SEC is already located. Assuming we even have conferences years from now, it's going to be a situation where the SEC can stay as southern as possible in states they're not already involved with. That would be the University of North Carolina. And if the SEC had a second choice, as weird as this sounds, I believe it'd be the University of Virginia. That would be the SEC's next choice for who it'd like to add to the league. But at some point in time, Chapel Hill, the Dean Dome, may have an SEC sticker slapped on the court, and maybe Kenan Stadium as well could be an SEC venue, at least if some of these rumors are out there. So we'll obviously kind of follow that and see where that goes. And we'll make that the Long Drink, Long Finish here today on DawgNation Daily, staying true to that name in this particular case. So this weekend, you're having fun with friends. Enjoy yourself some Finnish long drink. Whether it's the long drink citrus, that's no carbs, no sugar. I probably need to do that. Long drink cranberry, my wife loves that. Kaylee and me, our favorite, though, is that blue can. It's the grapefruit flavor. It's the gin kick. Kaylee will send me pictures on the weekend of her enjoying a Finnish long drink. I'm always glad to see that. How about the long drink strong? That's 8.5% alcohol by volume. There's the pineapple. There's the peach flavored version. There is a long drink variety out there for you. So if you go to the website, thelongdrink.com, you can put in your zip code. You can find where to pick some up today. Longtime friends of ours here on our program. So thrilled to have the Finnish long drink with us and looking forward to a fun weekend with the Finnish long drink as well. And with that said, we start to bring the plane in for a landing here. How about a golden shoe today? You know, I'm always impressed by how well-traveled so many of you are. We've shown photos from Europe so far this summer. How about going the other direction, Pacific Ocean here, in Hawaii on the screen here. And I forgot to put the name on this, and I apologize. Let me see if I can find this name quick. So the message is, hey, BA, I'm in Hawaii for a vacation, and I went to the, Mauka? The Mauka Warriors luau. After the show, my daughter and I got to take a pic with the Warriors. As I walked away, one of them saw my UGA hat and barked, "Go Dogs!" By the way, this comes from Richard Gines, is his name. Richard Gines. Go Dogs, sick 'em. We rep all the way to the island. How about them dogs? Boy, that's an awesome thing to see. Richard will give you and your family a golden shoe for that. And the Mauka Warriors a golden shoe there as well. Fun luau experience. You'd love to see that. All of those golden shoes going out. How about those lousy, stinking Gators? About 1,721 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. Back on Monday, DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs, they show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. We'll get some of your comments. I mentioned this before the show started to the video audience that joins us live before we begin the show, that if you were with us yesterday, there was the moment near the end of our broadcast where I had read a YouTube comment, almost said it on the air, and then decided to wait on it. That was about the passing of Hulk Hogan. Somebody had put that into the YouTube chat. There had been some dispute in the last day prior to that about what his actual health status was. Sometimes with celebrities, that ends up just kind of being the way that it goes, especially in kind of probably like a hospice type situation. Sometimes there can be some dispute about that. So you want to be careful with stuff like that. So we did not make mention of that, even though that news was breaking. I was having a hard time just on the fly confirming it to be officially true, and that's not the kind of thing you want to jump the gun on. But we have since found that out, and I know a lot of you were talking in the YouTube comment section about this. Obviously, this is a big deal to me. Like when I say emotional, I was not crying. I don't cry very frequently. But I was pretty bummed out about it or something. Like I was just I sat on my back porch yesterday evening and just going through Peacock and watching a lot of the old stuff and just kind of reliving some of it. And you can put yourself right back there where it was. And we'll talk Georgia football, I promise. But I just wanted to make mention of this. For me as a kid, I was really more of a fan of what y'all call wrestling. I liked Southern wrestling. I liked dark, auditorium, sort of grainy TV footage. I just thought that I've always just been sort of a, rural Southerner at heart. And for me, while I did watch the WWF product, the WWF was always a little too glossy for me. It was a little too perfect. Even back then, production value is nowhere near what they are now. It was still a lot more Hollywooded up, than what, they were doing in these small auditoriums across the South in sort of the various territories. I just like kind of a grainy, gritty version of pro wrestling, or what you might call wrestling. That's just what I liked. But you go back and relive these Hogan moments, and I'm reminded of, gosh, even though I think of myself as more of a, Boutwell Auditorium, Norfolk Scope, Greensboro Coliseum, the Sportatorium in Dallas. That's where I think of the pro wrestling of my childhood taking place. The truth is, these Hogan moments were actually a lot bigger part of my memory banks than I probably gave him credit for. A massive, massive figure. And so, I know a lot of you have been talking about that, so I at least wanted to make mention of that. Spencer Clark mentions the old Joe Pedicino show. So if you're young, you don't know this, but this was, now I may get emotional talking about this, so y'all be careful for a second if I do. So he mentions Channel 69. It used to be prior to that on Channel 36. So I guess what it is a guy named Joe Pedicino, and Bonnie Blackstone, if you know her, shout out. Joe Pedicino and Bonnie Blackstone. I guess what Joe did was buy a bunch of block programming. You can do that. If you want to go spend enough money, you can buy a block of programming from a lot of stations, and you can then put on the air what you want to put on the air. So I guess what Joe did was he bought a huge block of programming on Channel 36 on Saturday nights, and he would then buy syndicated wrestling shows. Do you know what this is? So if you watch certain daytime shows, things like that show is syndicated, meaning it may be on your NBC affiliate in Atlanta, but it may be on the CBS affiliate in Phoenix, right? Just like some of this is just sort of whoever buys it gets it. Well, a lot of these wrestling shows were sold as syndications. And so he'd buy them, and starting at 8 p.m. on Saturday all the way to 2 a.m., he'd show all these wrestling shows. My grandfather used to record these for me on a VCR when I was a child. And I'm talking about I can remember this as vividly as anything. He'd take these, video cassettes, record the shows, the wrestling shows, and then he'd stack them on a shelf in his house. I visited them frequently, and there'd be this stack of wrestling films, and I just watch them all. And you talk about, just the best stuff, just the absolute best stuff. That is my childhood. I also mentioned Mr. Wonderful earlier. Jonathan Aaron says his wife is related to Mr. Wonderful. Mother's maiden name was Orndorff. That's really cool, Jonathan. I had no idea about that. That's really interesting. And here's the one thing that I will say about all of this. And we sort of briefly mentioned this when Mr. Wonderful passed, which was a couple years ago now. Obviously, pro wrestling is a scripted outcome. But let me tell you the one part of wrestling that isn't fake. That's the business part of it. The tickets sold, the TV viewership, that's real stuff. And it fluctuates depending on the story being told or the wrestler involved in the story. That is just as much of a win-loss record as anything in legitimate sports. And when Orndorff and Hogan were doing their thing in the mid to late 80s, y'all, it was doing gigantic business. Back then a stadium show was a big deal. They did a stadium show in Toronto, did several, not prime time, but several network TV spots on Saturday night's main event. That's big business. In fact, a lot of people know this, that Orndorff was held out of WrestleMania 3. That's the big Hogan-Andre match. It is largely assumed that, Andre was not in great health by that point in time in his career. That if Andre couldn't have gone, they had to have a backup plan. And it seems like the backup plan, if Andre was not healthy enough to wrestle Hogan, was Orndorff kind of sliding in there and being the WrestleMania 3 main event. Now, that would obviously have been a big drop-off from what Hogan-Andre became, which, that's the one video you've seen everywhere the last day. But, had Andre not been able to do it, he was just not in great health. Orndorff probably gets that spot. Anonymous Handle says that I feel like wrestling fell off around the time that Mike Tyson started making statements about boxing. Well, the thing about wrestling is, in my lifetime, and maybe previous eras too, I don't know, but certainly in my lifetime, what wrestling does is like this. Wrestling goes up and down and up and down and up and down. And it's kind of funny. We are in an up period for wrestling now. Wrestling technically is more popular than it's ever been. But there's no individual star anywhere close to Hogan, Austin, The Rock. There's no disrespect to the current guys, but Roman Reigns is not in that category. He's just not. No one is in the category of what certainly a Hogan was in the 80s, where he was box office by himself. But like before Hogan was done in the WWF in particular, which was known at the time, their business had already taken a little bit of a downturn even then. Like you think about they were supposed to be at LA Coliseum for WrestleMania 7. They had to move it to the LA Sports Arena. They lied and said, they were concerned about, safety and security in the wake of the first Gulf War. We all know that's not true. They weren't selling tickets to WrestleMania 7. They had to move it inside, smaller venue. WrestleMania 8 was in a dome. It's a little bit of a disaster, though, I think anyway. The one sort of blind spot Vince McMahon always had was he would not, elevate stars from a different era. The WrestleMania 8 main event should have been Hogan Flair. Should have been. They didn't do it. And then by WrestleMania 9, and there's actually a really good documentary on Peacock from this past spring about WrestleMania 9. It's really worth your time. WrestleMania 9 was a mess, an absolute mess. So what wrestling does, it goes up and down and up and down. And, that's why as a fan, I'm sort of in and out, in and out, in and out, because it just, sometimes wrestling's as hot as it gets. Thankfully in my childhood, and then in my sort of teenage years, wrestling was so hot. But when it's not, boy, it's not. Kenneth Holt on the subject of the Tennessee situation. Yeah, obviously Nico's already gone. Now Boo Carter, we don't know when he's coming back. That's a lot to deal with. I do think so. And, Nico spoke out this week. Not really spoke out. He just spoke. It's not exaggerated. But yeah, Tennessee's kind of going through it a little bit right now. I think you're probably right. Free Durden shouting out to Miami Vice. 80s were a fun decade, man, especially to be a kid. I've said this before, that everybody kind of likes their era. I have a hard time believing there was any better decade to be a child in than the 1980s. The 1980s, what I like about the 80s was it was the world was just more kid-centric back then. Entertainment was more kid-centric. Entertainment's not very kid-centric today. And I think one of the things that made the 80s enjoyable is that, things kind of took on a little bit of a, movies, network TV, wrestling, things like that. There was just a little bit of a kid-centric focus. And the after effect of that, the stuff feels more timeless. It just does. I think that today you look around at various forms of entertainment, it's not super kid focused. And I think it suffers because of that. George on Tap giving a fun shout out to Gordon Soley, which I love. Oh yeah. Jack Fullerton, by the way, if you're going back and reliving some of the Hogan stuff, WrestleMania 18 against The Rock is one you got to do, because it's sort of sometimes the WWE fans take on a life of their own, and you had The Rock supposed to be the good guy, Hogan supposed to be the bad guy. This was the Hollywood Hogan heel turn thing, well after it happened, but this was still kind of doing that character. And the crowd is in Toronto. They just decided to treat Hogan as if it was still the old red and yellow, and they cheered everything he did. And you got two expert performers in the ring. They just rewrote the story on the fly. And Rock started doing sort of his heel stuff. Hogan started doing his face stuff. It's not what the match was supposed to be. But when the crowd was so clearly, every now and then they just try to especially around WrestleMania, they'll just try to sort of take over and see if they can rewrite the story on the fly. In that particular case, with two of the biggest names to ever do it, they changed the match on the spot. And if you watch it, you can kind of understand that they were clearly surprised by the reaction the match was getting. And like improv actors, they just went with it. And it was such a thing to see. It really was. Anonymous Handlaw, by the way, also shouting at Knight Rider. See, that's what I'm talking about. Like, Knight Rider was a prime time, and I promise we'll talk Georgia football. If y'all put Georgia comments, I'll read them. Knight Rider was a prime time drama on NBC. But it's for kids. Like, that's a show for kids. It had, adult elements, I guess, adult themes. Michael Knight's evil twin brother Garth, for instance, bad villain that he was. Goliath, remember that? But like Knight Rider was a network TV show kind of marketed towards kids, and it was amazing. Frederick Meredith asked about Nico. Nico's at UCLA now, and he appeared at a Big Ten Media Days this week. Anonymous Handle also points out something pretty good, which is this day and age, is this true? Other than like jumping, like what Kit, that was the car in Knight Rider. Now we can't push a button and jump, but talking to you, driving itself, like we basically have that technology now, right? Now the cool Trans Am that goes whoom, whoom on the front. We don't have that, I don't guess, but I guess we could make that. But pretty much anything that Kit did, we can pretty much do that now, right? Oh my goodness. All right, let's see what else. Let me go back to DawgNation.com. Garrison Tucker says, here's a hypothetical. No NIL or transfer portal. Is it battle between Saban, Kirby, and Dabo with the occasional Ohio State and Michigan? Well, I believe that if it's just, hey, which program's most positioned for success, it's more than the occasional Ohio State. And like, I don't like Ohio State. Y'all don't either. But if we're thinking about gaming out college football over the course of a couple of decades, Ohio State is more than just sort of an occasional whatever. Like, Ohio State just has historically done its business different than, teams like Michigan and whatnot. Like Michigan is sort of only recently decided they even care about any of this kind of stuff. Big fan base, I think most wins of all time. But, in terms of really being all that motivated for success, that's a relatively new phenomenon for Michigan. Ohio State's always had a different level of investment. So if you're thinking about, hey, without artificial manipulation of the market, who would Georgia's stiffest competition be? Ohio State's got to be in there as much as anybody, I think. DT says he saw a video of Hogan picking up and slamming Andre the Giant. Giant was 500 pounds then. Yeah, DT, that's probably the single most memorable Hogan moment. And I always say, and people laugh, but I mean this real, like that's a clutch performance because the match isn't what it is if you don't slam Andre. That was like Hogan's big thing. He was going to slam, everybody. And, when you get up like that, the wrestler's supposed to help you a little bit. Well, Andre's not in great health. Like his ability to really help Hogan get him up is not great right there. I tell you what I learned though, and I was so disappointed about this because like I was a kid in WrestleMania 3 time. Like I'm talking about a true child. Like my wrestling fandom was only a year or two old. Well, I watched the Netflix series on Mr. McMahon, Vince McMahon, and they said that Andre had been slammed before. And that, so like the match was sold as Andre's never lost and he's never been slammed. Well, come to find out, according to Netflix, Andre had lost and he had been slammed. Now, when Andre was younger, he was a good bit lighter than he was by the time that match took place. But you're talking about like spoiling Christmas or something. To find out that, according to Netflix, which I guess you take with a grain of salt, that wrestling has a tendency to sort of make stuff up that's not always true. Apparently, the idea that Andre had been undefeated for his career and had never been basically body slammed, apparently that wasn't true, which I was super disappointed to find that out. Garrison Tucker says, do we see Bobo change a lot his scheme for the talent he has this year? Is this the deepest wide receiver core he's had since 2023? Well, in terms of overall depth, it may be the deepest that Georgia's had in a while. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got a Brock Bowers and a Vlad McConkey catching passes, because I don't necessarily count that as depth, because I think they only played together, basically once all season, right? And so you may not have certainly the top-end talent that Georgia had in 2023, but the overall depth may be greater. As far as, changes, like I'm not going to pretend to know like how the play calls might change. I don't pretend to know that. But I will say that, Jake Fromm said this on Tuesday, that Georgia was, to use his phrase, a little pass happy last year. And it's weird. Ever since Monken came around, and we all love Todd Monken. He helped Georgia win 2 national championships. Like Monken is a pivotal figure in Georgia's, football success. But in life, there is no free lunch. If you do this, it has a ramification somewhere else. And around the time that Todd Monken arrived, Georgia became a better passing team. The numbers bear it out. Even in 2020, by the way. People forget, Monken was also the offensive coordinator in 2020. Even in 2020, Georgia became a better passing team. And for the 3 years of that, and for the most part, the 2 years since then, Georgia has been a better passing team than it probably has ever been. And there has been a trade-off. They have not been as good at running the football. This is one of those years where you sort of wonder, does that veer back a little bit? Like, I tell you an interesting comparison. And I don't think that people necessarily want to go back in time this way. But go back and look at the overall profile of the 2018 Georgia offense. 2018 Georgia offense, that's a team that they average like 37 points per game. They're pretty close. I think they're second in the SEC in scoring. I think Bama scored more than they did that year. Georgia, I think, was second best, I think. They had some success through the air. They're a better passing team in 2018 than they had been in 2017. A lot of running game, though, right? There's a lot of DeAndre Swift, Elisha Holyfield. I almost wonder if, in some respects, like a 2018 version of the Georgia offense, very successful, but a little bit more run-happy than we sort of think of it being now. I wonder if Georgia does get back to some of that and how people would feel if that was the case. If Georgia was scoring 37 points per game, more on the ground than through the air, would Georgia fans be happy about that? The results were pretty good back then, and Georgia fans didn't really feel like the offense was explosive enough and exciting enough. I wonder how they would feel about that. UJ Marine says, I wonder who has it worse as they get older, long career pro wrestlers or football players. Wrestling, one of the things it's done is like the wrestling that I grew up with was just sort of an extension of the Carney age, right? It's like there's a lot of stuff that you couldn't talk about. I mean, a lot of bad stuff happened in wrestling, a lot. I'm talking about real stuff away from the matches. Gosh knows, there's 8 million documentaries about all this. Like the wrestling of my age growing up was pretty dark. I mean, it was not a made for prime time entertainment thing. It just wasn't. Like the stuff happening in the back was kind of gross. Wrestling's not like that anymore. Like the WWE is basically Disney now. I mean, it really is. Their wellness stuff is, it's almost like they've gone too far. Maybe, I don't know. But so I think the wrestlers, they're still independent contractors, which they sometimes complain about. But the health stuff for wrestling is way different than it used to be. Way different than it used to be. Let's see what else. DT says, used to be a big Dusty Rhodes fan, then you kind of get busy in life, you step away from wrestling, you realize that Hogan's a huge star. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that is, it's like I said before, like the box office part is real, that you can fake the outcome, you can write the script, but it's just true that certain people generate a different box office response than others do. And, you know, the 93,000 people at the Silverdome, I mean, some of that is as much as I love the legend, like some of that's a little exaggerated. And that story's been told. I mean, by the time they get to the main event, they're just dragging anybody they can into that place. They're trying to get as many people into that stadium as possible. But it's still center house football stadium. I mean, it's still a gigantic crowd. You know, even if it was embellished just slightly. But the stuff on NBC, you know, Hogan got wrestling moved to like prime time on NBC back when that might mean 30 million people watching. I mean, it was big, big business. All right, let me go to Facebook. Let's see what else on the Facebook side of things here for today. That might mean 30 million people watching. Ken Holcomb says, I recall Mr. Wonderful showing up at the kids' wrestling state championships at McIntosh High School when my youngest was competing, and folks said he was going to take the gold medal. Yeah, that's really fun. He says, obviously, great success for the McEachin Indians back then. That's really fun. That's really fun. Yeah, so I grew up in Gainesville. You know, wrestling used to happen a lot in Gainesville. And so you'd just be around town and you'd see wrestlers. And I just remember as a kid, like the first time you see some of these wrestlers, you're scared. You know, it's like, you know, it's scary, right? Because, you know, you're just a kid. And then you sort of slowly start to learn, oh, these are just people. They're like, you really, you know, you would see them around town. You'd sort of learn, oh, this is just a person. By the way, Gerald Harmon also shouting out the Dukes of Hazzard. That was as good as it gets for me. I mean, I'm just telling you right now, there was not a bigger Dukes of Hazzard fan than me. Philip Jordan Wells also shouting out NBC back when Knight Rider, A-Team, Miami Vice. Yeah, I mean, you had some good stuff. And they sort of bounced around the various nights for some of that kind of stuff. But that was always great. And Gerald also looking forward to the new Tron movie. I'm not a huge participant in the sort of Tron movie verse. I'll tell you this though, I do like the Tron Light Cycle Run at Magic Kingdom. Though that's a fun ride. I would recommend that if you get a chance. Philip Jordan Wells also remembers Hee Haw. Yeah, one of these days, just like, or you know, there's a time in which you had a lot of like sort of rural themed stuff on TV, and then one day CBS just did with all of it, just like that. Hee Haw, Mayberry, Petticoat Junction, all of that just gone. Just they say no more, and they just got rid of it all. And then Hee Haw became a syndicated show. Jamie Huff says, as a kid, he used to help put a wrestling ring up as a job. I think that's really cool. Like, I've actually never been in a wrestling ring. That's the one thing I would really like to do, is I'd like to be in a ring. Never actually been in a ring. I would love to do that. How about this? Greg Baker checking in on his drive from Nicaragua to El Salvador. What an amazing thing. He says going to go surf some right-hand point breaks for a change. Have a great, that's really cool. Greg, what an amazing thing that is. If you think of it, send us a picture. But what a cool thing that is. What a cool thing that is. That's awesome, Greg, to have you checking in. I told you we have a very well-traveled audience, and Greg's certainly an example of that. Salisha Gagnon thanking us, congratulating us on the milestone. Yeah, I appreciate that, Salisha. That's really nice of you to say. Brian Whitaker says, I remember on Friday night going to the video store and being able to get a movie and one video game, either a movie or a video game as a big choice back then. Yeah. I think for those that didn't quite grow up in like the Blockbuster era, or really probably some of the local video stores, like the one-off mom and pop was even better. Like physical media, album CDs, cassette tapes. Physical media had a smell. I've always been weirdly into smells, which is a strange thing, especially new stuff. New stuff has kind of a neat smell. And physical media had a neat smell. I think the VHS cassettes had a neat smell to them. And when people are always, there's all this like nostalgia stuff online, which I try not to get involved with too much because it's just a huge time suck. Because it'd be very easy to sort of fall into that trap. But when people show the old pictures of like Blockbuster Video and there's always like these like, this is what they took from us type stuff. Like the thing that always comes rushing back to me is how video stores smell. They just had a very interesting smell. I feel like baseball card shops also had a smell too back then. It was the cardboard in the case of the video stores, the plastic. But this like prominent smells. For some reason, I have very vivid memories of that, which is probably weird. Gerald Harmon on the subject of silver spoons. Gary Holt mentioned the Fresh Prince. So, like, I rewatched WrestleMania 2 yesterday, Hogan, King Kong Bundy. And speaking of silver spoons, at the height of his fame, the guest timekeeper for that match was Ricky Schroeder. Wrestling has always been obsessed with celebrities, dragging celebrities in for like the most nonsensical reasons. So, super famous Ricky Schroeder was guest timekeeper for WrestleMania 2, which is funny. Silver Spoon's also an example of a sitcom that was sort of marketed to kids. Very kid-centric era. And I think when we think about the 80s, about what makes it so special, I would say for those of you who are alive for it, I would say the kid-centric nature is what makes it feel so timeless. Archie Hughes says, 80s were best for growing up, 90s were best for college. I mean, I'm biased because that's my story, but boy, it feels true, doesn't it? It feels true. Now, the early 2000s, people will sort of sell their thing on that. And honestly, like, this was still a really fun society, early 2000s. But yeah, it sort of feels like, I'm not big into generations. I think a lot of that stuff's overblown. But the sort of Gen X thing of, kid in the 80s, teenager in the 90s, pretty good experience. Pretty good experience. Chad Godwin, very different thing, on Facebook says, I was a child in the 70s in South Georgia. We worked in the tobacco fields all summer. It kept us out of trouble. Yeah, that is certainly a way to stay out of trouble, and a very different experience there for sure, but I'm sure you're a better man because of it. By the way, Jamie Huff remembering Freaknik from back in the 90s. Boy, that was a interesting time in Atlanta's history. Anything else? All right, let me take two more comments, then we got to go. DT reminding us that Kirby, while WrestleMania 3 might have exaggerated about getting the 90,000+ slightly into the Silver Dome, Georgia legitimately did that with room to spare back in 2016, and that is certainly true. Randy Hall says, the theme this year is Run, B.A. Run. Yeah, you better believe they're going to be doing that. I think maybe even, if I had to guess, maybe even more so than they've typically done in the past. Maybe the case. John Main says he also grew up in Gainesville, wrestling at the Georgia Mountain Center. I worked on the square as a young teenager at Henrio's. Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool. Really cool. Yeah, I used to go to the Mountain Center for wrestling a lot. It's sad that, the Mountain Center's like been annexed by Bernal now, which is, I don't have anything against Bernal. I'm just saying I miss the Mountain Center being the Mountain Center. You go see gospel concerts there and wrestling and stuff like that. That was just like, and by the way, the square in Gainesville now is like it's like a city now. It's crazy. Crazy, beyond crazy. But back when I was a kid, the epicenter of town was the Georgia Mountain Center, where you have, WCW Saturday night tapings and stuff like that. That was all good stuff. Anonymous Handle mentions the Box. I remember the Box. I remember the Box is the place I first found out what Britney Spears was. I feel like back then when that Hit Me Baby One More Time, when that song was like literally everywhere, I feel like the box is what made that song popular. All right, we're going to get ready to go. Colby Straughter wants some call-in, so I do think we're going to do this. I really do. And we may do it fairly regularly. Colby, I believe we may do that. Kenneth Holt says his dad and cousins used to work in the tobacco fields in South Georgia. They used to jump in the pond to wash off the nicotine sap. You're talking about just a different world. You got to jump in the pond to wash the nicotine off so you don't get a buzz. That's really something right there. And listen, nicotine, not nicotine, tobacco's like a stoop crop, right? Like you got to bend down to pick it, correct? Which is hard. That's hard work. I mean, that is hard work. Oh my gosh, that's hard work. But better men because of it, for sure. George on Tap said he was a 70s kid, spent time working in his dad's carpet mill. I'm guessing that was real work too. So you love it. All good stuff. All good stuff. All right, we got to go for now. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. Air conditioning, you've been out working tobacco fields or carpet factories, whatever else. When you come back home, you want to feel cold air blowing in your face. Well, our friends at RS Andrews can make sure that stays true for you. Old AC unit, perhaps a little bit past its shelf life, RS Andrews may be able to tell you how you can get some new life out of that old unit, and it only may cost you $99. Find out more online, rsandrews.com. That is rsandrews.com. You'll have a great day. Back Monday. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then.